Hello dear learners, I am Dr. Jyoti Mathur, Associate Professor, Department of Economics, the Bhopal School of Social Sciences. Welcome to this module on interest, its concept and types. In today's session, you would learn about meaning of interest, definition of interest, types of interest, that is gross and net interest, elements of gross interest and the justification for the payment of interest. Interest. It is a payment made by a borrower to the lender for the money borrowed and is expressed as a rate % per year. It is usually expressed as an annual rate of terms of money and is calculated on the principal of the loan. It is the price paid for the use of others' capital fund for a certain period of time. In real economic sense, interest implies the return to capital as a factor of production, but for all practical purpose, interest is the price of capital. Capital as a factor of production. In the money economy, however, for all practical purposes, capital refers to finance or money capital, that is, the monetary funds lent or borrowed for any purpose of expenditure from any source. In strict narrow sense, again, capital may refer to only funds borrowed for real investment in business by the business community from financial institutions. Let us take into account some important definitions of interest. In economics, interest has been defined in a variety of ways. Traditionally, interest is regarded as the payment for the use of services of capital. Let us look into the definition of interest given by Professor Alfred Marshall. According to him, the payment made by the borrower for the use of a loan is called interest. In the words of J.S. Mill, interest is the remuneration for mere abstinence of money. When we talk about the Keynesian definition of interest, interest is the reward for parting with the liquidity of money for a specified period of time. The modern economist, in order to avoid the divergent and controversial views about interest, have explained it in terms of productivity, saving, liquidity and money. To them, interest is the reward for the yield of capital, of savings, for the foregoing of liquidity and the supply of money. Thus, they have explained it in terms of demand and supply of money. Coming to the types of interest, interest can be classified into two heads, net interest and gross interest. Gross interest. It is the whole amount that the borrower has to pay to the lender, while net interest is that part of the gross interest which is paid simply for the use of capital. Thus, gross interest is the total amount of interest paid by the debtor to the creditor. The creditor gets interest because he has got the sense of waiting, and the borrower pays him interest because he gets an advantage of productivity from the capital. Let us talk about the important constituents of interest or elements of interest. One of the main is net interest. Net interest is the payment made exclusively for the use of capital. In the words of Alfred Marshall, net interest is the earning of capital simply, and it's a reward for waiting. Gross interest includes, besides net interest, the following elements like payment or compensation for risk. The lender has always to bear the risk. The risk that the loan may not be repaid. Besides this, borrower takes the loan at the time when his requirement is urgent, but when he returns it, it is quite possible that the time may not be suitable for the lender's point of view. To cover this risk, the lender charges more. that is, in addition to the net interest. Thus, when loans are made without adequate security, they involve a higher element of risk, so a higher rate of interest is charged. Compensation for inconvenience. When somebody lends the money, he has to bear inconveniences till the period when he gets back the sum. That is, a lender lends only by saving, that is, by restricting consumption out of his income, and which obviously involved some inconveniences which is to be compensated. A similar inconvenience is that the lender may not be able to get his money back as and when he may need it for his own purpose or use. Hence, a payment to compensate this sort of inconvenience may be charged by the lender. Thus, the greater the degree of inconvenience caused to the lender, the higher will be the rate of interest charged. Cost or payment for management services. A lender of capital fund has to spend money and energy in the management of credit. For example, in the lending business, certain formalities have to be fulfilled. Say, fees for obtaining money lender's license, stamp duties, etc. Proper accounts must be maintained. He has to maintain a staff as well. For all these sort of management services, reward has to be paid by the borrower to the lender. Therefore, gross interest also includes payment for management expenses. Compensation for changing value of money. Under this, when prices are rising, the purchasing power of money declines over a period of time and the creditor loses. To avoid such loss, a higher rate of interest may be demanded by the creditor. By now, I am sure you know what is gross interest. Gross interest includes net interest, payment for risk, payment for management services, compensation for the changing value of money. Let us recap into what exactly is gross interest. Gross interest includes net interest, it includes payment for risk, it includes payment or charges for management services, and it includes change in the value of money, that is, the compensation that is to be paid to the lender by the borrower for the change or deterioration in the value of money. Dear learners, at this time, it is very important for you to know on what grounds the payment of interest is justified. The first justification for interest is productivity of capital. Interest is paid by the borrower to the lender because borrowed money or capital is productively used. The other justification is compensation for parting with liquidity. As Keynes has said that interest is the reward for parting with the liquidity. When a lender lends money, he undergoes a sacrifice of present time consumption, is parting with its purchasing power to the borrower. This is to be compensated by the borrower to the lender by paying a rent of interest as agreed upon. Interest is justified to induce saving. Lending of money mostly comes out of savings. Savers are induced to save more by restricting consumption when higher rate of interest are paid. When investment demand is in excess of savings, interest rate will go up. Interest can also be justified to mobilize loanable funds. Banks and other financial institutions offer interest rate to mobilize loanable funds from the household sector to the money and capital market. People may opt for financial institution for their savings when attractive return are offered by the financial institution. Financial institutions serve as an intermediaries and pass on these funds, so mobilize to the firm sector to the real sector. Similarly, the demand for money on the lender's side is also justified for the reason for abstinence or sacrifice of immediate consumption undergone by them in parting with liquidity. They also claim a share in the income generated by capital in its productive use in terms of interest rate. They also face the risk of losing money when the loan is not repaid by the borrower. To compensate for all these risk elements, they reasonably demand for interest. To conclude our session, we can say that in economic equilibrium, the demand and supply for capital determines the net rate of interest, but in practice, gross interest rate is charged. Gross interest rate are different in different cases, at different places and at different time and for different individuals. The understanding of interest is particularly of great use in lending and borrowing of funds in the market. Interest is one of the most important factor influencing volume of investment in the economy. Hope this session has created a practical understanding on the concept of interest.